to engage, and then you can proceed, because I am recording the session, and I will do an edited version later. But okay, so we are online now, and so
So the four stages of development of the anima, as I said, as a modern woman, I also feel that it applies to me, even though there's another slightly separate theory called the development of the animus. But what Jung said is that there's a contrasexual element in the psyche. In order to feel whole, we have to come into contact with that contrasexual element. So in a woman, it would be the inner man, and in a man, it would be the inner woman. And as long as we don't do that, we project on other people. We project that anima on other people. And so he said that the anima is a complex very deep within the psyche. And if you can imagine the psyche, just to start again at the very, very beginning, the structure of the psyche, if you imagine that you have a big, let's say a big orange, at the very top of the orange, where the stem is, you would have the ego, you know, where it connects with the outside world, where the orange connects with the tree. You have the ego at the very top. And then the rest of the orange is the field of consciousness. And as you go down this orange, you have the field of the ego is what we are conscious about. That's what we know. That's what we recognize about ourselves in the world. And it's a tiny bit of the orange. It's a little bit of the surface. And as you go down below the level of consciousness, you'll start to notice that there are things, other archetypes, like the shadow, like the persona. And then if you go further down, you will meet deep complexes, very, very deep inside the psyche, like the animus and the anima. And then at the very bottom, if you like, that's the part where we're all one. We're no longer male or woman or American or Swiss or even a human. You know, at the bottom of the ocean, we're just existence. And all this field is called the self. And the archetype of the self is something that you want to be in relationship with. And in order to become in relationship with, your ego will have to start relating to these unconscious fields. The first one is, of course, the persona, because the persona is the mask of adaptation you have to your life. So, and then the shadow, all the things, all the negative things about you, that you don't know, but you project on other people. You say, oh, he's like this and she's like that, etc. And you don't realize that you're like that too. And as you get to know your shadow, of course, then you start to forgive yourself. And as you forgive yourself for being envious or angry or whatever, you start forgiving others. And then a bit deeper, you get the animus and the anima. And the anima, so we're talking about the anima today as the inner woman. She's very, very far from consciousness. So a lot of people say, oh, I'd like to ask, guidance from my anima about what I should wear tonight for a date. That's not a good idea, because the anima doesn't relate to the outer world. The anima relates to the inner world. She's your guide to the inner world. And so that's just kind of the general framework. But the anima has four stages of development. In other words, we're talking about psychic processes, but she can develop, or in other words, the man who carries her can develop. And those four stages, Jung talked about them and gave them names. So there is the stage of Eve, Helen, Maria, and Sophia. And so the first stage, and of course, this is not a development that is linear. Some people start with Eve and other people start with Sophia, because we're all born different and we all approach the world very differently. And at different times in our life, different aspects of the anima might constellate, as we say. But if we just take it as a gradual development in an ideal process in a sort of non-existent male, he will first get to know this inner part of himself as Eve, because Eve is the mother. You know, she's the mother in the Bible. She represents the virgin forest. She represents the very elemental psychic background. So when a man is born, or even a woman, our first relationship to the world is through mother. And Eve is the mother in the Christian myth. That's who she is. She is the mother of all of us. And she represents everything that is undifferentiated, but in symbiosis with nature. It's very elemental. It's the earthly essence of man, and he's not conscious of his early essence. And so she comes through as something very elemental. She comes through in symbol like a snake, for example. That's a symbol of Eve. So when a man is identified with Eve, he is in an undifferentiated relationship with consciousness. That means that he's subjected to her influence without being able to really think about it. It just happens. When he sees a woman, he sees mother. And this will be, of course, extremely powerful and luminous, because mothers are very powerful in the psyche. But it would also be mediated by his own personal experience of mother. So if he has a good relationship with mother, you know, Eve will be bountiful and ever giving, and she's the milk that comes out of her breast, you know, endlessly and continuously. So that's Eve, and that's what he expects of women. Nurture me, feed me, give me life. So that's, you know, in a nutshell, we can go back and go deeper into these ideas. But this is the first step of the development of the anima. And then there is a second step, which we call, I'm just looking at my book so that I follow some kind of line. The second one is called Helen. Now, Helen is, you know, in Ulysses, you know, she's the one for whom the Trojan War began. Yeah, she was so beautiful that her beauty launched 1,000 ships, and the whole of the ancient world was ready to fight for her beauty. So this stage of the anima is, in the first stage, the man is only concerned with being given to. Be my mother, fulfill me in any way. I don't have to do anything but just ask. In the second stage, there is the beginning of what we call otherness. So this otherness comes through the erotic relationship, in a sense. Suddenly, a man will say, ooh, she's pretty, she's beautiful, I want to have a relationship with her. And so Jung calls her, he calls her Helen, because of this erotic principle that's so exciting when men discover it, sometimes at 8, sometimes at 15, it depends, but suddenly this throb, you know, physical embodied desire starts, and so he becomes interested in her. And in the book, in the red book, she's called Salome, but in his psychology, she's called Helen. And so when a man is developing this stage of the anima, he's falling in love, but it's erotic love. What he wants is to understand pleasure, sensuality. And so the other person, whether it's a man or a woman in the psyche, is only interested in the other, again, as it can fulfill you. So when a man in that stage of Helen says, I love you, beware, because he's loving his beauty, his desire, his pleasure, his excitement, but he's not really looking at the woman in front of him. That hasn't been developed yet. And that's very much what you can see in teenage love. And sometimes that extends for a lifetime. You know, you have the archetype of the Don Juan who never goes beyond that stage, because as long as it's fun and erotic, he's interested. But if you start talking about commitment and things like that, he will disappear. So roughly that would be the stage 2, discovering your own pleasure. And in Jung, that's very important in the Red Book. And then you have this third stage, which is Mary. And he uses Mary as Mary, the Mother of God, in the Christian story. So Mary is the one who says, let it be. She's the one who accepts what comes. And a very important image of the development of the anima into Mary is compassion. There's enormous compassion. If you look at the statue of Michelangelo, of the Pietà, you know, she's holding her dead son in her arms with this attitude of let it be, but she's fully and completely present and aware. There's no hatred, there's no rejection. It's just, I accept. So the development of the anima at that level is where a man will start to really see his partner and relate to her as a different human being that he can love, that he can care for beyond himself, or in a woman beyond herself. So there's a really very big difference between Eve and Mary. You know, and Mary is the heart. And when a man has developed a heart, his attitude, or a woman, to life is completely different. The other can exist. And then the fourth stage of development is Sophia. Sophia is wisdom. She was also in the Bible, but she's kind of occulted. She was supposed to be the right hand, or the feminine aspect of the Godhead, but it's been taken out pretty much from the standard Abrahamic religions. You see her in symbols, or you see her as Holy Ghost, or you see her like this, but you no longer see her like you might in India, where you have the goddess is there and she's present and she's full of power. But Sophia is the development of wisdom. So beyond compassion, there is also a wisdom, a very sharp way of knowing your own authority, what is good for you, what is good for the world. And a man who's developed, or a woman who's developed Sophia, has not only a heart, but a very acute sense of vision of what might be good for himself. And later on, we can talk about the Anima Mundi, which is another development of the anima. And the Anima Mundi, if you like, is the world soul. And that's a very profound and mystical development, because all of a sudden the soul is no longer a function in you that you develop. You realize that the soul is everywhere. It animates, Anima Mundi, it animates the world. So you can see the soul in a bird, in a cat, in a beautiful sunset, and your whole being can vibrate to that frequency. And so when you've developed a connection with the Anima Mundi, then you're very, very aware of how we're treating all forms of life, whether it's the environment, whether it's the animals, whether it's what we eat, because when we are inside the soul, we are the soul. The soul it radiates everywhere. And so it becomes, impossible to have a disconnected, objective relationship with life, because everything, you feel the connection with everything. And you can't just eat a chicken that's been, bred in horrible factories and has never had a life or a feather, and you can't absorb that because it just doesn't work. You want to be in a relationship with all aspects of consciousness, for the betterment of all. And there's a sense of oneness when you're in the Anima Mundi. So, in a very, very short, I hope that's kind of answers your questions, that you have a sense of the 4 stages of development of the anima.
Right. So I think that that's extremely important. And before I comment, though, let me let others speak. So, Kushbu wanted to say something.
I wanted you to elaborate on the, the world soul.
Anima Mundi.
Yes.
Yeah, because, and also if you can address me, the more I stepped into that energy, the more I feel I have become intolerant uh, for a lot of things in life. Like, so intolerant, it means like if a child is being abused, I will like I can pull a punches without thinking about it unconsciously. But I wasn't like that. I was also very simple, selfish human being who wanted humanly ordinary humanly things. Um, but the more the consciousness expands, I believe um, my tolerance is getting very lower for certain things. And I think the coronavirus thing, I have not been upset about it, and I think it's my shadow. I don't know, but I have not been upset about it. I'm like, maybe we deserve it, and it so and I feel, oh my God, I'm thinking like that. Like, is it a grim thing to think about? But like, my truth is that I'm not so upset about it. Ozone is, fixed. Ozone layer is fixed finally. So, 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 so so if you can just elaborate on that process, like how does it manifest, and where do you see that spirit acting out in individuals in in our quarantined time together collectively? Yeah.
It's very difficult because if there's one thing that Jungian, or I as a Jungian, is to try not to generalize too much. So I think everybody will have a very different experience of these stages of development. Um, what is very clear as you begin a process of individuation is that you're no longer bound by collective values in the same way, that you have found an inner authority at some point in the journey that allows you to function in a spontaneous way. And spontaneous can be good or bad in terms of the world, but it means that you have found a coherent line of being, and you can trust that you can respond even if 2 minutes before you don't know that you're going to say this or do that, but it's still functioning in that access that you've developed. And so spontaneity is really a signal for me of an individuation, somebody who's not thinking prior, or what will that, if I do this, or I do that, or I say this or that, what will happen? That you can be so whole, you have your energies functioning and you can just respond and then deal with the consequences. But you're not so attached to the image that you project. And that's very important. That's the development of the persona. That's even before work on the anima, you work on the persona. You try and understand what values you've been born into collectively in your country, but also in your family. What were you taught at a very young age that was right and wrong? How have you adapted? Do you believe these things? And you have to go through a process of sorting out everything in the basket and say, this is me, this is not me, this could be me, this is, until your persona, which is a mask, and that a mask of adaptation, if it works, because we all have a persona, the teacher or the housewife or the it changes. Our persona has to change all day, but it has to be flexible, like it's almost invisible on your face. And then it's adapted to you. And then, it's like if you're a doctor and you put the white blouse, you're not changing fundamentally who you are. You're just adapting to the role that you're playing in society. When the persona is not flexible, when you don't know yourself, you haven't chosen your values in a certain sense, your adaptation is like this. You're always a little rigid in everything that you do, and you can sense it in the people that you're speaking to, that you don't really know who's in there. Knock, knock. Who are you? And people who've worked on their persona, you have a sense of flexibility and spontaneity. They're there. You get a sense pretty much of what kind of person they are. So persona and shadow work together. In order to release the rigidity and the crustiness of your persona, you have to know yourself. You have to go into the shadow, as we said earlier on. So that doesn't really answer your question. It's a long way back to what you were saying, is I'm being spontaneous in ways that I wasn't perhaps before. And you're saying,
and
what does that say
correct.
about me?
Very true. Very true. Very true. Yeah. And all don't like it.
Don't people not always like it? Yes, you have a question, Miles?
Thank you very much. I'm sorry I'm late. I had time zone confusion, but I'm glad I've joined here, and I read most of the essay that you provided and found it very fascinating, and what I just heard very fascinating. I'll say a few things maybe related to Khushbu's issue with her feeling of becoming more intolerant, and suggesting that I believe it's justified. And as I say this, I'm probably going to create some enemies, but someone shared a quote from Churchill, who said, if you have enemies, you're concerned that you have enemies, well, good, that means you're stirring the pot or mixing it up, right? So what I'll say is my concern, I think there's been errors of commission, active errors by men with respect to the Abrahamic religions that you've talked about, such that these Abrahamic religions are stunted consciousness now. For example, I learned not too long ago that most translations of the Bible in Genesis use the descriptor Eve was Adam's helper, a helper. But apparently, if you go into the ancient languages, the term is to describe her as rescuer, not helper, which is kind of a derogatory or somewhat, diminishing term. A rescuer really elevates the importance of Eve. And so I'll just say that, as a man I've now lived with a wonderful wife for 20 years, I'm still working on connecting to understand the feminine and to rise through these stages that you've described. And I'll just say that, it really began, I suppose, I think back, I had a friend, I was the youngest of 3 boys. So I never saw my mother pregnant. I never saw a sibling being born, but my friend who lived across the road, his mother was pregnant. And when I was in grade 1, I remember his mother inviting both myself and my friend to be in the room when she changed the little baby daughter that was born. And I was like, wow, my goodness, the anatomy is even very different, and it was still like kind of a shock, right? So anyway, I'm just sort of sharing that, from even then to today, I'm still trying to get through these stages of development of understanding the anima. I think I'm getting closer with all this learning that I've gotten through from Skip through Jung and now you. So thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Nancy, what about you?
Well, I was, what Miles said brought something to mind. And in your article, you mentioned that one of the problems with Christianity is that the anima had not been developed completely. I don't know if I'm saying that right, but do you know what I'm talking about? Do you recall that part of your essay?
I'm not sure that I said the anima was not developed. Again, it's very individual. You can say in a collective, we could, Chesterton said, Christianity never failed, it was never tried. So again, there are individuals, who have developed in certain societies or in certain times, to great fulfillment, all these stages. And meanwhile, right next to you, your neighbor might be in a very different position. So I don't think I could say that the anima is more developed today than it was 1,000 years ago. It depends in whom.
Okay, were you referring to the writers of the Bible when you might have indicated?
Well, it's clear that, if you go back to especially with the Gospels, the ones that were found in Nag Hammadi, when you have the word of Christ that's been unedited, and I've written quite a lot about that. If you read the Gospel of Thomas, for example, you have a very, very different experience of the truth he's trying to convey, the experiences he's trying to convey, that they're very hard to find in classical Gospels, because they have been edited, for 2,000 years. They were translated from the Aramaic to the Greek, and then the Greek to the Latin, and little monks were transcribing, and then one guy didn't like this word, so he just slipped in another version, etc., etc., etc. So the end product is very, very far, in my view, from the freshness you get when you get to read those Gnostic Gospels, because it's right there. He just says, I'm here,
Yeah.
It's the stone and I'm there. Well, that's very useful. That's the Anima Mundi. Okay,
yeah.
You're right here.
One of the interesting experiences I've had recently is, and I'm talking about within the last 2 months, is that a Jewish analyst for the first time made me look at Michelangelo's painting on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. And in that painting, God, who's touching Adam to bring the spark of life into him, has his arm around Sophia, has his arm around a woman. And first of all, I never noticed that fact. In fact, in many, many versions of that image, she's cropped out. And so you don't even see that he has his arm around Sophia, or any woman, because she's not identified, of course. But here in Michelangelo's painting from 400 years ago, yeah, there it is. And there she is. I don't know who's sharing that, but thank you. Thank you. Is that Miles did that? Thanks, Miles.
Yes, I did.
Okay, so there we have God with his arm around Sophia, but nobody ever in my lifetime, I'm 73 years old, ever pointed that fact out, pointed out the significance of that particular woman as opposed to any other woman, or any other such thing. And so finally it took a Jungian analyst a Jewish Jungian analyst to point that out to me, and so that I could even see it in that image. And I wonder if you have any comment about that.
Well, I think that's very moving. I never knew it. I'm going to study it. I mean, the way the feminine has been eclipsed in society is just mind-boggling. I mean, if you look at most traditions, I'm talking about the Western world, because as I said earlier, in India, it's very, very different.
Yes.
The feminine is vibrant over there. I go to India a lot.
Mm-hmm.
I'll just interject also that there God and Sophia and those other children, I would say, are in enclosed in a womb is another
Yes.
thing that was pointed out.
There's a
Right.
very womb-like feminine there. You're very, very right.
Yeah. Incredible.
Yeah, it makes me think also of, Leonardo's Last Supper, where James, who's sitting next to him, looks uncannily like a woman. And of course, people say it's Mary Magdalena,
Yes.
who also was edited out completely as his consort,
Right.
wife.
You,
Probably.
it's like you stole my thought when you mentioned Mary,
Yeah.
because last week I never knew her name, but I'm quite into the literature in my life from last 3 years, but I never knew her name, and I was so ashamed. So I spent like good around 48 hours in last week to study her, and I might have wept at least for 4 hours, like just thinking of it, even like being ashamed of like why I was not aware about it. Like it totally makes sense. Like it, and yeah. So I want. I'm not asking you to respond on my weeping and other stuff. It's quite natural to me. I cry happy also quite a bit. But I want you to tell your interpretation, like as yeah, coming from you, like how did you discover, and as an analyst, how, like what experience you had about it. So if you feel comfortable, and just my video is off because I don't want world to see me
I
having
just
dinner.
didn't understand your question very clearly. My experience of what?
Mary the idea of Mary Magdalene.
Well, Mary Magdalene is the inner feminine. I mean, she's the embodied inner feminine. If her story was allowed to exist, she would be the anima of Jesus, right? She would be his
Jesus.
wife.
Correct.
You know, in the ancient Jewish tradition, you could not be a rabbi if you were not married. And in the Bible, and you see it in the Garden of Gethsemane when she says, Rabbi, Rabbi. And of course, if people call Jesus Rabbi, he's married. I mean, at the very simple level. But let's not, be too interested in the physical or the mundane story of Jesus. It's much less important. But let's see it as a story, as a myth, a great myth of gods and so this great teacher had a wife, and in the Gospel of Mary, which is one of the Gnostic Gospels, all the other apostles are try to reject her after her death because they said that and it's in the Gospel of Philip, she's described as the most loved of the disciples. And so, of course, that constellated a lot of jealousy because she was a woman, and women in these societies were not highly respected. Plus, she had, a special status with their leader. And apparently, he told her the secrets before he died. And there's some nice little quotes there in that gospel. And when she tries to speak, Peter is always cutting her off. Because as soon as Jesus is gone, he's busy creating the church. And none of that woman nonsense will do if we want this religion to grow and be accepted by the Greek and travel to the rest of the world. So very quickly that principle got lost in patriarchal societies. And that's the main problem we have here in the West, is the loss of the feminine. And the loss of the feminine, in a way, is the loss of heart. We've developed our reason, our logos. That's what we did in the West compared to the East. At a certain price. The feeling function in the West is underdeveloped. we're capable of doing horrible things to children and animals and nature, horrible things. And this is a loss of the feminine. It's an underdeveloped feminine. It's a child saying, I want, I take, I want. It's Eve. The development, in a sense, is Eve. Give me, give me, give me, give me. I will mine the earth. I will fish the fish out of the ocean. I will kill. Me. There is not even an erotic dance with the environment saying, okay, I put a little flower here and you make me happy and I water you every day and we start a relationship with nature. So we've made reason, Jung called it the sacralization of the goddess reason. We made thinking, logos, reflect, that's much more important than the heart. And we're paying the consequences today, yes. Yeah.
And
so
as I'm sorry, Miles here. So
you're upside down, Kushbu. Can you turn your device over?
But I'm still upside down.
You're still upside down. There you go. Yeah.
Okay. So let's. What a loving, friendly advice you will give to the situation as a author, as a
find your heart.
Just another.
Find your heart.
And
it's not as easy as one thinks. Sorry?
God bless you for saying that.
But it's not easy, because we lie to ourselves all the time. You say, look, I just fed a neighbor. I'm a good person. That's not the heart.
Yeah. I did my insight was that logos is merely a skeleton. It's a structure that has no life in it. For example, I often shock people by holding up a Bible and saying, this is just a black doorstop unless somebody puts life into it. And my point is that everything that you see in the room around you is the 100% logos, in the sense that everything has to be perfectly made in order for you to want it, whether it's your sofa or your eyeglasses or the computer in front of you. Everything like that requires logos. It requires perfect construction, but it's still a thing. And even conceptualization is, again, a structure. And there's no life in that. There's only life on the eros side. And that's what we've missed. We've missed life.
I'm not sure I would agree with that stance. I think some people can see the transcendence through logos. Everybody has a different way of developing. You have feelers and thinkers. You have people who look in yoga. You have karma. You have different kind of yogas. You have bhakti yoga. You have the yoga of the heart. But you have the yoga of the mind. If you can develop a very, very clear mind, it's not cold. What you're referring to, in my view, is technology. Mm-hmm. Technology is a son of logos, but it's not the logos principle. A thought, a poem can suddenly completely illuminate everything if it's clear.
Right, but a poem itself is logos. It's the word, but it's the intuition, the spirit. That's the eros. That's the life, though. That's the life side.
But that's a spirit. That's also a spirit. Miles, you're wanting to ask a question.
Yeah, I'll chime in. I can understand Skip because, and I understand you as well. So maybe I'm coming up the middle, but I'm calling in from Canada, and I'm on the traditional territory of the Blackfoot Confederacy. They're named by their language as the Niitsitapi. And that means the people. Their name for God, I don't know it in their language, but it is their God is the giver of life. And in Canada, we're struggling, or we've been confronted through the energies of the First Nations, the Indigenous people, to have to face up to our history. And that's a history of imposing the logos over everything and over the land, an economy of logos. And in fact, what we have is the Indian Act, which is 150 years old. It is still law in Canada, and we're still trying to come to terms with it. But in summary, 150 years ago, it was all about crushing the Indigenous culture, which was matrilineal and matriarchal. And they therefore specifically, this Indian Act is specifically targeting the matriarchy of governance that used to exist in this land, you know, and because it's such an affront to the logos way of doing things. So anyway, I just wanted to share that.
Well, I just have a different understanding of the word logos. What you're talking about are patriarchal structures, the powers that use, powers that don't relate. So in that sense, you might think, oh, it's the opposite of eros. But I see it more as a very patriarchal attitude that's very sick, not necessarily as a description of logos. I mean, for the pre-Socratic philosophers, I mean, logos was a divine understanding.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I wanted to share with you
not
one
just intellect. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, I wanted to share with you one image that I sometimes show, just because it might interest you. This is a scene near where I live, and the boat in this image is a 64-foot motor yacht, and the name of this boat is Never Enough. And the point is that the owner, he's got presumably started with a smaller boat at some point, but the point he's making with this name is that he's never satisfied. He's never been able to have happiness because no matter how big he's gotten his boat, it's not enough. And furthermore, that this boat has no life in it. It's sitting there at the dock. There's nobody in it enjoying it. So there's actually no life in that. And yet by logos, it's been perfectly built, and it's beautiful.
By technology, again.
Yeah.
I'm not sure that it's necessarily logos, but here again, you're talking about spirit, code, and matter. If logos is spirit, it's been materialized, it's lost, it's shine, it's spirit, it's sparkle, it's just crude materialism. And that's where, you know, a lot of us get lost in a misunderstanding of the marriage of the inner marriage of the spirit and the soul, of the feminine and the masculine, where they both are beautiful principles that can work together. There's not a good guy and a bad guy. It's just how you use these energies. But if matter, which is feminine, technically is engrossed in itself without any spirit, you know, it's corpse. Matter without spirit is corpse. It's just dead.
Right.
So we need these two elements, and materialism is something that we suffer from because there's a loss of spirit as well.
Yes.
There's a loss of something that makes spirit is what makes things shine, right? I mean,
right.
It's that little light that makes everything sparkle.
Yeah, so I want to just mention to you how sparkly this group is right now, because I just want to go through the people that are here. We have Nancy, who is in Reno, Nevada, Miles, who's in Alberta, Canada, Joss, who's in Honolulu, Khushbu in Bangalore, India, and Mirtus, who's in Brazil. And then you, who is, you're in Zurich. And so it couldn't be a more representative group of people in the world, maybe. Let me recognize Joss for a minute, because Joss is our duty psychiatrist. So go ahead, Joss.
Thank you so much, Daria, right?
Dariane, yeah.
Dariane. Oh my gosh, it's very, very refreshing. And you're very articulate in bringing out about the 4 stages of the anima, which is so important for other listeners if they are doing YouTube, and especially like young men. I think this world needs the feminine energy now to bring it to balance. And this is a very critical time for us women to radiate and bring our heart energy out to the world. I just wanted to just give a little anecdote. I'm a retired psychiatrist, and I do recall having worked with abused women. And in one of my practices, I had a man in my therapy session, and he was very sympathetic to abused women for the reason that he was abused himself. And if it wasn't for, you might say, the taste of the other side of the coin, he wouldn't have been able to bring identification to his feminine side, or sympathy to the opposite sex. But as a child, he was abused by his brother, and basically raped. And so when he would hear about women having been assaulted or sexually abused, it would cringe. He would feel, this anger towards his own, male, colleagues, and well, not that just colleagues, but just men in general. But I thought it was quite interesting, because I don't see too many of this phenomena. Oftentimes, I think men, when they, especially with this Me Too movement, I think this is like we're in a new period now in moving the feminine consciousness into the masses, that they're now becoming aware of the repercussions of their actions. And so I would like for you to maybe perhaps comment on that.
Well, for me, it's really important not to confuse the gender and the feminine principle. And it's so difficult because the words are traps. So the redemption of the feminine has nothing to do with Me Too. It's about finding this inner partner that can lead you to develop more and more consciousness, more and more compassion, more and more wisdom. The anima is never going to go marching down the streets to change the condition of anyone. It's an intra-psychic process. So I try to often say, look, think of animus and anima as yin and yang, or something that is more like a principle of an opposition principle, because it's not about women. The feminine in man. We've got somebody here who has a mask. It's the feminine in a man. It's and the feminine principles are like yin and yang principles. They're not. Women have not developed better the feminine than men. Not necessarily. Some men have highly developed feminine principles, and women can be patriarchal. I mean, really patriarchal. So in that sense, it's hard to just not think that the well-being of women in society has to do with the development of the feminine. It is, in a sense, if you have more heart and more compassion and more wisdom, then of course you won't do horrible things to other people or to people of a different sex or a different race or etc., etc. But women should not say that we own the feminine. We don't. We have to develop our feminine just as much because it's not developed in the culture, in society. We're not raised with these values in school. They teach you to become better and ambitious and produce and all this. These are not feminine values, even if your teacher is a woman. Is that clear?
Yeah,
The
very much.
distinction between the feminine and the female, it's not the same thing.
That's
Could you
beautiful.
elaborate a little more on the feminine principle as opposed to gender?
Yes, so that's where they hook in together, because traditionally, anything associated with the feminine, women carried in Jung society, in 1875, women hadn't gone to school, or they had no rights. They couldn't vote, they couldn't own land, so the female principle, the feminine principle, has a lot to do with receptivity as opposed to action. For example, action would be a masculine principle, action, direction, whereas the feminine is more in stillness, in being, those kind of qualities. And that's why they got equated with, a woman should know her place and not speak and not act and not go against anything. That's not the sacred feminine. If you want to have ideas about the feminine principle, the sacred feminine supports the masculine and is supported by the masculine. If you think again of Jesus and Mary Magdalene, or any sacred couples that you know from any other culture or mythology, these are principles that support each other, and that when they work together, your feeling is one of wholeness. You can no longer say there's a bully and I'm a victim. When you have this inner marriage between the masculine and the feminine inside yourself, you recognize that there's no big separation between outside and inside. And you're no victim. You're nobody's victim. Because again, victim, bully, all these are projections. We're all developing. And we have to pull these as long as the woman, like for example in the Me Too movement, the woman is a victim. Now the sacred feminine, there isn't an ounce of victim in if you look at a portrait of Mary Magdalene, she is nobody's victim. Or you look at a portrait of an Indian goddess, oh man, they're right there, body and soul, erotic and alive and bright and Durga,
Frightening sometimes. Frightening.
and Kali and all these people. I mean, this is power. We're talking about the God archetype with, different aspects. So
I just wanted to add, like in lots of Indian mythology, the way with my limited understanding, I say this here, but this masculine and just as yin and yang, masculine and feminine, of course it is supported by each other, but it is also sustained by each other.
Mm-hmm.
So when I and it is very evident to see in lot of stories, like they're always longing for each other, and then the mythological stories have emerged, like they are longing for each other. Yeah.
But longing is what fuels individuation. If we didn't long for something, we'd just stay home and read books, you know. It's the longing that gets her going because we know something's missing. But if we're really talking at that level, there is no masculine and feminine. We're differentiating in order to try and understand these things. But if you think in the archetype, it's just one experience. When you're within yourself and you're quiet and peaceful and serene and completely present to the moment, you're not asking, where's my masculine and where's my feminine?
Right.
All this, it disappears. There is only an experience of oneness.
Dariane, I'd just like to share with you an experience of the last 12 hours for me. First of all, let me preface this by saying that my wife is, you know, effectively a Tibetan Buddhist Lama, although she never took ordination, and but she has done a 3-year retreat in Tibetan Buddhism and has been studying it for 25 years. And meanwhile, she served at one point as the chairman of the DC Rape Crisis Center. Okay, that's one of the things that she did years ago. I mean, when we were first together, maybe 30 years ago. And so last night, Nicole Esplin was our featured guest, and she made the comment, I just want to say it, can we do away with feminism? Can we get rid of feminism? Okay, that was her comment. And then this morning, I just observed that comment to my wife, and she said, well, we can't get rid of feminism until, because there's 2,000 years of patriarchy that we're fighting against. And this is my issue about how we educate society properly. And so, I mean, my wife has a Phi Beta Kappa. Okay, she's a smart lady. And she's been a teacher of Tibetan Buddhism, which is all about dualism and so on, for years. And yet this is her reaction. And to Nicole's comment, which I thought was apt. And so I wonder if you might comment on that, because somehow, I mean, here's 7 people right now that are trying to get our arms around this, and yet there's 7.5 billion of us on the planet. And how do we get people into the process of understanding these ideas? Because, you know, as I said, it was only within the last 2 months that I even realized that Sophia was in the Michelangelo painting. So, and, you know, I'm into this. I wrote an autobiography of my anima, right, among other things. And so, what are your thoughts about that?
Well, first of all, I have a lot of sympathy with your wife's comment. You know, we can't do away with feminism until women becomes a respected equal and partner in the structures of our society. How we do that, you know, is again a more complicated subject. But somebody was telling me not so long ago, oh, but feminism, I mean, what's that? I mean, these feminists, etc. And I looked at him and I said, you know, feminism is not about women. I don't know a single man in my life who's not a feminist, because anybody with this ounce of intelligence would be a feminist in the sense that equality is a value that we want to uphold in society, right? So in that sense, we are all thinking, educated people, we're all feminist. Now, how do we get to a status of equality for women or for any underdog in society? That's a lot more complicated than, you know, marching down the streets or anything like that. Because first of all, you have to value it inside yourself. When we can start valuing our conscious sexual element, in other words, the man in me, because, you know, women have men hating parts just as much as men have women hating parts. And those are going to have to be tackled. Otherwise, how will there be peace in the world if there isn't peace in our own psyche?
How do we tackle them, though? That's the question.
Self-knowledge. That's the good old, you know, Socratic way. It's the way since the beginning of time. Know thyself. You know, that's what they said in at the thing of Apollo in Delphis. That was written, you know, as you entered the temple. What was that? What, 2,600 years ago? Know thyself. And as you know thyself, myself, of course, you cannot continue blaming others who are doing exactly the same thing you are. Mm-hmm. So as you forgive yourself, as I said earlier on, you start forgiving others. When you notice that you have all these awful negative qualities as well, then you can start owning them, owning your own negativity. I'm sorry, I'm in a really bad mood today. Well, that's a lot more helpful to your partner than just screaming for 2 hours, because we can all understand being in a bad mood. Surely. And if it's said, I'm sorry, I'm probably going to be a bitch all day because it's my day to be a bitch. Keep away. That's a dialogue. You own it. And the other one goes, okay, I love her. She's going to be a bitch today. I'll go golfing, whatever. But if you're just going, no, I'm fine. My mood is great. Why are you telling me you're the one who's in a bad mood? Then you have a war. You have a war inside. You have a war at home. You have a war on the planet.
Right.
Yeah.
I'm still struggling with how to.
Dariane, that was beautiful.
We are raising consciousness here. There's no doubt about that in terms of this video, but I'm thinking of something that's more widespread than.
Well, I'll just quickly share, if I could. You know, what you've done, I'm sharing on a personal level. What Skip has done is educated me, because it's only been, I don't know, a few years. I stumble across Skip and then go to his channel, and since then I've been educated. So case in point, if somebody said, so who is your anima, before I met Skip just maybe a few years ago, anima, I would have thought, oh, that's got to be your enemy, because anima, animosity, that's what I would have said. Even the word matriarchal or matrilineal, those were not even words in my vocabulary. I would have had a hard time explaining them just even a few years ago, because the present education has been so powerful to do just exactly what the Indian Act was all about here in Canada, and that is to repress the concept of matrilineal and the Indigenous way of looking at the world, which was you don't own Mother Earth. What says own land? That was a completely foreign concept to them 150 years ago. And that's why the patriarchy specifically, and the Indian Act specifically targeted the matrilineal concept, because holy cow, that's a real paradigm shift, that men and owning land doesn't make sense. We can't have anybody talking about that concept. So when you said find your heart, Doctor, you know, I wrote that down because finding your heart is for me, is actually, having encountered this Indigenous worldview, and Jung is into the mix now, is actually revealing the virtues of Jesus to me that I had never heard. And I've been through a number of different religious Christian experiences. So anyway, Skip, you're educating me. And if we can get more of this happening in this video and everything else you've done, we're really making headway, I'd say. Thank you.
It's a start.
And to me, you are very comforting. I was almost I might would have, it is a hate is a heavy word, so my intolerance is normally towards men, because yeah. But yeah, so for me it's finally something comforting. Yeah.
Well, thank you, Pushpu. Mirtas, you haven't had a
And I
chance.
have a question. Why do you think that this is your previous comment, that why do you think this is unconscious? You made a comment like that.
That what is unconscious? And it's hard to
The
remember everything I say.
exactly. I actually Sir Skip made this comment that we are going into a little unconscious. Was I right? Did you make a
Well,
comment like that?
I'm simply saying, and it's been my observation for over 30 years, that Jung's ideas are basically in a silo, and that silo is within the world of the Jungian analyst. And the world of the Jungian analyst, based on Jung's own conservatism, I understand, is deal with it individual by individual. And the question is, we have the world is in a terrible shape, and it's blowing various things up, and we're going to have to realize that we're all in the same leaky lifeboat, and maybe it's time to figure out a way to get this a little bit more broadly focused than just individual by individual, because Jungian analysts, if there's 30,000 or 3,000 of them in the world, and maybe each one of them can deal with how many, 20, 30 analysons at a time. So now you're reaching 90,000 people at any given time, perhaps. And yet we're leaving untouched everybody else in the world. And this is,
Well, Jung talked about the process of individuation. It doesn't happen just because you see a Jungian analyst. People have been finding truth in themselves since the beginning of time.
Surely.
I mean, that when you look at paintings in the Neolithic of the so-called primitive caves of France and other countries, I mean, those people knew something about life and values and the sacred. So, it's been around forever. Jung coined it and discussed it in a particular way that appeals to us as a community, because his thought, for some reason, fits with our own embodied who we are today. But you can find these things by being a Christian or a Zen Buddhist or a Native American or just a gardener. You can develop your anima, you can develop your relations to life, you can open your heart. It's not a privilege of Jungians in any way. So yes, it's wonderful that you want to disseminate Jung's thought, but
yeah, I think
for everybody. It's not for everybody. The Jungian path is not easy.
I'm not meaning to suggest that we disseminate Jung's thought. I mean the fact that I, as a young man, was never taught how to interact with women. Okay, I had to work it out over my lifetime, and it, going right back to sex education classes or health classes. So for guys, my peers, when we were in the 8th grade, the women were separated from the boys. The girls and the boys were separated. The girls went and learned about the facts of life. The boys were taught some things about nutrition, basically, something like that. And that's the attitude that we've had in society in our in our puritanical society over over my lifetime, as far as I can say. And so how do we fix that so that we help young men and young women understand that this is a process? There's a process of transformation that takes place. I mean, nobody in the Christian church ever taught me that the pastors were trying to bring us through a transformation, which is what they do. Okay, that's what they do. But I think even they don't know it. Okay, they've learned.
Good morning, Kempo.
They've learned a structure, a formula in theology school and in divinity school that they go out and practice in their pulpits, but they don't really understand why, is my perception. Okay, and so that's troubling, and I don't care if it's Hinduism or Tibetan Buddhism or Judaism or Islam or whatever. You know, I've been in all those societies, but how do we bring children along so that they're doing this sooner and they see these things sooner? That's what I'm struggling with.
It's a big question. I don't know how much I believe in outer teachings, you know, because for me that's very behaviorist. It's behavioral, or even behavioral psychology. You know, I'm going to teach you how to do this better, because for me that's surface. What you want to develop is an individual that is comfortable with who he is, that has a sense of who he is, and can relate that properly with his environment, personal and physical. So do we teach that, or do we facilitate that? You know, if we force kids to go to boring schools for 12 years where they learn nonsense most of the time, because it's good for college, or it's good for your memory, or it's good for I don't know what, but you haven't received a single lesson in truth.
Yeah.
What is true for you? What is true for me? How do I respond to you? How do you respond to me? Who are we in this group? Yeah. How does it work? You know, none of that is taught. It's none of the values of our society. There's no feeling.
Right. One of my favorite.
There's some great teachers out there doing fabulous work.
Oh yeah.
Again, I have to be very careful of generalizing, but the structure of society is imposed on us. Try and change the system, huh?
No, we're not changing any system.
Yeah, but the system doesn't teach you to go in and learn about who you are. The system teaches you how to get out there in the world.
Right. Right. And one of my favorite lines in all popular music is from Paul Simon's song Kodachrome, which is, when I think of all the crap I learned in high school, it's a wonder I can think at all.
Yeah. We were talking about, you know, logos earlier on. You know, a well-differentiated logos is wonderful. People who really think clearly and can bring things to essence, it's a wonderful thing.
Right.
Who thinks today? Everybody's responding and reacting. I feel this and I don't feel that. Yeah, so what?
Right. Mirtis, did you want to contribute here, or what is your pleasure?
No, I'm just listening and absorbing and seeing, watching things reacting in my head. Okay,
that's fair enough. I have a deal with Mirtis where I won't put her on the spot. And so
I'd like to know something before we finish, and that is, Dariane, if you have a blog or some way we could keep track of you and what you're writing and what you're doing.
Well, I have a website, I don't put a lot, and I'm in the process of reworking, so a lot of my stuff is not up there, but at least it tells you where I'm lecturing and what I've written.
That would be great. What is your website?
Dariane.net or .info. I have both titles.
Thank you.
Okay, terrific, Dariane.
I used to have lots of poems on my last one, but I haven't put them back up.
Yeah. Dariane, first of all, on behalf of everyone, I want to thank you very much for sitting with us today. It's very powerful. And it's so important from my perspective, but we have a tradition that Khushbu is going to close our session with a Sanskrit mantra, and so we'll leave it at that, and we'll be in touch.
Thank you very much for the invitation. It was lovely speaking to you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for your patience in being here with us. So, Khushbu, you're up.
And I just and I will love if you can come once again.
Thank you very much. Bye bye.
Yeah.
Take care.
Yeah. We'll do the prayer and then we'll finish it.
Okay.
We pray for well-being of all the worlds and all the people of all the worlds. Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. Loka samasta sukhino bhavantu. Shanti, shanti, shanti. God bless you.
Thank you so much, Khushbu. And our next session will be on Tuesday with Rabbi Stephen Fuchs, who is past president of the World Union of Progressive Jews. And he's going to give us a different perspective, and that's for sure. Thank you so much for being with us today, Dariane.
Thank you very much.
Really appreciate it.
Bye-bye.
Peace. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.